wonderful family back there and that very quiet baby of hers. She is working toward her PhD in the history of the modern Middle East. Please welcome Alyssa Walter.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much to the AAUW for having me, for funding my scholarship and the research of my other esteemed colleagues here. It's been such a pleasure to get to know more of you and to learn more about the AAUW. So my name is Alyssa Walter. I am a PhD candidate at Georgetown University, and as Dale mentioned, I've been out here loving the Bay Area weather. Fortunate to be working in a collection at Stanford University in support of my dissertation research. With the support of the AAUW American Fellowship, I am completing my dissertation this year, which I hope to defend this spring and graduate in May. So keep me in your thoughts. Now, the subject of my research is state-society relations in Baghdad during the time of Saddam Hussein's dictatorship. I was originally inspired to look at this topic, as you may remember from the news, after the 2003 US invasion of Iraq, when Saddam was removed from power. Iraq descended into many years of what was called sectarian violence. It was called a civil war. There was all sorts of opportunistic violence as well, kidnapping for profit, and ordinary crime and score settling. Now, I was curious, in the face of a foreign invasion, there are many different possible responses that could happen. It wasn't a foregone conclusion that this would be the outcome. A lot of times when you're attacked from the outside, an impulse is to rally together and to unify. So why was it that in the city of Baghdad specifically, more so than in other parts of Iraq, you saw a splintering, an imploding, a turning of neighbor on neighbor? Why was that? Now, I'm a historian, so I wanted to go back and look at some long-term causes and say, what was it about how the government ruled? What was it about the way daily life was under Saddam? What was it about the way that Iraqis themselves related to one another that perhaps laid the groundwork that made this outcome more likely? Now, when I started looking into this, it turned out we knew actually very little about what daily life had been like under Saddam Hussein. And the reason is that it was a very difficult topic to research. It was a country that was closed off to Western researchers for decades. State-produced newspapers and information isn't reliable, of course, and we had no other source of information, resources, documents that we could get at. Now, this is a long story that I will make very short, but it turns out that Stanford University has the archives of the former ruling party of Saddam Hussein called the Ba'ath Party. Now, those of you who may have heard about this know there's a bit of controversy surrounding it, which is why I'm making this story very short. But essentially, when the US went into Iraq and took over the headquarters of the Ba'ath Party, there were tens of millions of documents inside, and there was a desire to safeguard those so that in the future, perhaps there could even be some kind of truth and reconciliation commission like happened in South Africa and elsewhere. So we wanted to preserve the evidence. With the violence that happened, the instability, it was impossible to, eventually it was determined that it was impossible to keep those records in Iraq, that they just couldn't be kept safe. So through many different series of decisions, they ended up at Stanford University, where they've been open to researchers since 2010. So I am among the first cohort of researchers that's had the privilege of getting a sneak peek inside what went on in a dictatorship. And as you could imagine, this is very rare, not just for the Middle East, but I mean, we hardly ever get this kind of unfettered look into what really goes on in an authoritarian regime. So with the support of AAUW and other grants, I've been working in those archives now for over 2 years. There's, like I said, 10 million pages. They're all in Arabic. They're not very well indexed. And they are only accessible on site in a basement during business hours. So we had to move out here. It was a real hardship. So I've had the privilege of working in those. Now, answering the question of why did Baghdad fall apart in the way it did, as you can imagine, there's a complex answer to that. And that story has many different threads and components. And my dissertation addresses some of them. Today, I just want to talk to you about one finding in the few minutes that we have, just to give you a taste of some of the work that I've been doing. Now, Iraq has had its share of challenges over the decades. Those of you who are, Model UN, history nerds, newspaper buffs will be familiar with some of this. But so Iraq had 8 years of war against Iran from 1980 to 1988. It was a terrible war. 1 million Iraqi men were conscripted. It was a total warfare, total mobilization. After that horrific war was ended, very quickly was followed up with the Gulf War, the Iraqi occupation of Kuwait. In response for the Iraqi occupation of Kuwait, Iraq was placed under some of the most stringent sanctions ever to be imposed on a country. No oil could be sold, which meant they had no income as a country. Restrictions were placed on what they could import, and they had no money to really buy things to import anyway. So the economy was absolutely devastated. The salary of a state employee went down to $2 a month. Starvation wasn't a risk, but malnourishment was, and this was a sort of famous issue about Iraqi children being terribly malnourished during this time. The currency, through hyperinflation was basically worthless. So from a country that had been really a middle income, middle class, progressive, modern, industrial society, it was an incredible blow. And ordinary people had a lot of challenges and to know how to respond to this. So there are two things that happened during this period that I think are significant for understanding what Iraq was like the day before we, came and to take out Saddam. What was it like the day before? The one thing that happened was that the Iraqi government, which sanctions were supposed to weaken the government, right? That's the point of sanctions, to weaken the government to help Saddam kind of fall from power on his own. Well, what happened was that the opposite happened. So the Iraqi government put together a very successful food rationing program to provide roughly 1,000 calories per day to every single Iraqi citizen. It worked. It was actually very well implemented. This meant that in order to eat, the government was who you were relying on. So even if you opposed the government, you really weren't in a position to jeopardize your health, the health of your family, for your basic food. Now, the government realized the kind of leverage it had, so it would threaten to cut off rations, not just to you, but to your entire extended family if it suspected that you belonged to an opposition group, or if you deserted from the army, or if you stopped showing up to your government job because it only paid you $2. So it actually increased the kind of leverage that the government had. Now, because of that, more people actually joined the Ba'ath Party during this period than ever before, because the government had the resources. So with the government having all this leverage, it further was able to manipulate people and try to turn them against each other. Now, in any dictatorship, they rely on paranoia, they rely on informants and spies. Well, Iraqis were pressured to inform even on their own family members. So I found letters in the archives of fathers turning over their sons. And because the family's rations had been cut off, and the only way to get them restored was to turn in the offending member, right? So people were being turned on one another, and the government was gaining more and more tools of coercion to do that. At the same time, people were so desperate for money that ordinary crimes skyrocketed. I mean, car thefts and robberies and all those crimes of economic opportunity increased tremendously. So there was a general sense of lawlessness and disorder, and people were trusting each other less. And then people simply had less to share. Now, the Middle East prides itself on its hospitality culture, and I've benefited from this many times in my own life, in my own travels. People didn't have as much to share, and so it tore apart this essential part of the social fabric of the city, where people didn't have, couldn't help their neighbors in need, couldn't help their family members in need. And so what we see is that this period of 13 years really changed the way that people related to one another. It changed the way people related to the government in a way that resulted in more fragmentation and isolation. And this, I think, is just one part of the story about why it was that after the invasion, people were not positioned to unify. There were a lot of deep-seated fissures that were invisible from the outside, but in fact were very deep. So this is just a little bit about my research. Again, I want to thank AAUW so much. As a result of their funding, I've been able to stay here in California, as I said, close to the archives while I write. The AAUW grant is also paying for childcare for my wonderful 2-month-old daughter, Luna. so that I can complete my dissertation and graduate on time. So thank you very much for your generosity. I really appreciate being here today.
A daughter of immigrants from Ethiopia. She was raised in Chino, California, and she is doing something that I have never heard of in my entire life. She is doing 2 years at UC Berkeley and 3 years at UCSF. She'll come out with, what are they called? A Master's in Health and Medical Sciences, and then she'll get her MD degree. So why don't you tell us about it?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Excuse me, I'm a little ill, so I have a little bit of a crack in my voice. So I am honored and humbled to be standing here in front of you all as the recipient of the AAUW Career Development Grant. I am a rising second year medical and master's student at the UC Berkeley, UC San Francisco Joint Medical Program. Or what my classmates and I like to call the JMP. And so the JMP is a program where you spend the first 2 years getting your master's degree at Berkeley, while also learning the foundational sciences of medicine. And then you transfer over to San Francisco at UCSF and you complete your clinical rotations there. And so by the end of this program, I will have both a master's degree of science and a medical degree. In addition, I'm a proud member of the Prime US program, which is a program created to educate and support medical students to become physician leaders to care for US urban underserved communities. So growing up, I witnessed a lot of the effects of healthcare inequality through the care that my family members received. From misunderstandings with physicians about medications to very, very long lines at the emergency department for simple ear infections because they didn't have health insurance. I saw what a lack of access and health literacy could do to an individual's health and well-being. My parents interwove the values of responsibility, generosity, service, and perseverance into our family's mission. These were lessons that guided me through my time at Stanford University as an undergraduate, through my work as an asthma researcher post-college until I had started working at the JMP, and through my work as a volunteer at the Women's Community Clinic in San Francisco. It helped me get through all of my triumphs, but also to make it through some of the disappointments. I am currently working on a master's degree that I have designed a research project to look at the effects of environmental air pollution and maternal socioeconomic factors to see how those combined and are related to lead to an increase in preterm birth in California urban communities. So preterm birth is the leading cause of perinatal mortality and morbidity in the United States. And disparities amongst racial and ethnic groups have yet to be fully understood, as well as reasons for why people who come from low incomes tend to have higher preterm birth. When you think of preterm birth, it's actually really important to think about the fact that it predisposes you to severe chronic diseases later on in life. If you are born prematurely, you're more likely to have diabetes, to have hypertension, to have cardiovascular disease. And so in thinking through why I wanted to do a research project on preterm birth, I thought of all of these other diseases that I could potentially affect earlier. And so thinking about going upstream and trying to tackle the issue before it happens. So given that urban communities are primarily composed of women of color, I wanted to have a better understanding of how these maternal factors, as well as air pollution that primarily affects urban communities, could interact and maybe could help inform future research studies that tackle this issue on a more scientific and molecular basis. And I hope that I will be able to also potentially affect policy interventions that are needed to address this sort of disparity. As a future health disparity research myself, I am interested in being able to use medical research to understand differences in health outcomes, to alleviate health disparities, and to improve patient care. I hope that my master's project will be able to explore some of the origins behind these differences in health outcomes, and to help me kind of on my path to become an academic physician focused on addressing health disparities in different communities. I have been tenacious in my pursuit of medicine, but that dream has also been burdened by significant financial debt. And so I am very happy that the AAUW has been able to offer me a scholarship to help relieve some of the stress that comes with the fact that I have so much debt, and that I know I will get to where I want to go, and this scholarship has made it a little bit easier. And so I'm grateful and thankful to the AAUW for the scholarship. Thank you.
I have to start by telling you that there's actually error in the records in Washington today. So when you read that there's a fellow from Brazil named Adele, that's wrong. She's never been to Brazil, so we'll figure that one out later. But right now, I want to just quickly introduce Adele Kuzmiakova, right? Kuzmiakova. It's not really that hard, you break it up. She's actually a native and still a citizen of Slovakia. But as a teenager, her family moved to Switzerland, where she grew up. But she had the foresight to look at U.S. colleges, and so she has an engineering degree from Cornell. And living back in Switzerland, she was researching graduate things, and she'll tell you what she's studying, and we're proud to have her at Stanford.
Marie, thank you so much for your introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your generosity, and thank you for giving me a vote of confidence and support in my own project and my academic studies. So as Marie mentioned, I'm Adele, and I was born in Slovakia, not Brazil. It's very far apart, but at some point I would love to travel to Brazil. So maybe this is a starting point of my future journey. So when I was a teenager, I moved to Switzerland and went there for high school. And when I was 18, I started to look into colleges, and I moved to upstate New York to start my undergrad studies at Cornell. So I spent there a couple of years enjoying what was a very harsh winter in my freshman year. So I'm just now much more appreciative of this wonderful weather. I remember my freshman year, I got there, the weather was really mild, so I thought, oh, that's just a really nice country. And I thought the weather is going to be there for the rest of the season, right, until March. Well, little did I know that way back in October, the weather would suddenly get colder. And in November, it started snowing. It's like, oh. And the snow was there until March. So that was my introduction to Ithaca, weather, or winter season. But my undergraduate was wonderful, and then after 4 years, I moved back to Switzerland. And I started there working as a research assistant in one of the technical colleges and universities. And I stayed there for 2 years working on the research assistant and completing a master's degree in conjunction with another university in England. And then after that, I started looking into different graduate schools. And at that time, I didn't really know what the funding situation will be for my first year. And I did some research on the internet, and I just couldn't find any scholarships or fellowships that would be applicable to international students. Because then, as I'm sure most of you may be familiar with the NSF fellowships, but those are only restricted to US citizens. So I think as international students, we are just set apart. But then luckily in November, I was just so fortunate to come across the AAUW website and found out about these international fellowships. So I applied in December and I just waited for the result. But in the meantime, in March, I got my acceptance letter back from all the universities that I applied to. And actually the most wonderful option was from University of Iowa. There was a professor that I wanted to do research with, and it seems just a wonderful choice. I got a 5-year fellowship and another scholarship that would just pay, like I would be actually like a rich PhD student. So just, a wonderful choice, all 4 seasons again. I'm pretty sure Iowa winter would be very similar to Ithaca winter. So I just knew what to expect. But at the same time, I got my acceptance letter from Stanford again. But the situation was just much more different. I got accepted to another master's program, which I didn't apply to. But I applied for a PhD program, but what they were saying is that, yes, you can come here, but you can start with a master's degree, and then it's actually not funded. Yes, and with the graduate cost being just so sky high, I just couldn't really imagine like paying and maybe like going to the lab just to afford another 5 quarters, 6 quarters of another master's. So at the point, like, oh, I just threw the letter into the trash can. But in April, I actually got this wonderful news that I was awarded the fellowship. It didn't pay for the entire cost because costs at Stanford are just so sky high. But this actually was a starting point. It was a starting point in my just own journey. And I kind of like sat down with my acceptance letter and said like, oh, is there any chance I can turn this situation around and maybe look for another avenues at Stanford to get the remainder of my funding? And then I was just looking at the internet and started reaching to different professors in my own department because I was applying to civil and environmental engineering, but I started to look outside into computational and mathematical engineering and other engineering departments. And after what turned out to be a 1.5 month work, I finally get an acceptance letter from a professor that I'm doing a research with. So just for me, just took, I think around like 60 emails to like 60 different professors. But in the end, like all my work paid off because the professor actually, it turns out that he had another funding that would be able to complement my AAUW fellowship. So he had enough funding to cover my first year. I was just really grateful because I know a couple of stories from my fellow classmates that they got into Stanford, but they were accepted as a TAs or teaching assistants, which means that every quarter they have to be a teaching assistant for a class. And that just ends up being 20 or 25 hours per week on the top of the coursework and the research. So they're just basically spread thin. Whereas I'm just so grateful because I don't have to go through that. Thanks to the AAUW fellowship. So after after my search ended and I was able to be accepted to my current group, I was just so relieved. I wasn't really happy because I had to say no to Iowa, but I'm pretty sure they had another amazing applicant to take my spot. So I think things turned out quite well for them and for me as well. But I think the whole experience and just this AAUW fellowship being a starting point in my own journey that I would just never ever envision before, it was a really like key and pivotal point. And through the whole experience, I just learned that, oh yes, like, you can be successful. If you ask for what you want, if you leverage your skills and experience, and if you're not afraid of making the first move. So I just started my graduate or PhD degree in computational and mathematical engineering at Stanford in September. So I'm not actually that deep into my research as the first recipient was saying. But just to give you a brief overview into my research, so I work in areas called smart cities. And basically what we are looking at is looking at the existing data in terms of energy that's being used by buildings or even cars, and then trying to predict where this energy demand will be in the next day or the next week. And we also look at different weather models. So for example, we look at the past weather data. For example, just to give a brief overview, right now I'm working on looking at a specific building on Stanford campus, and it's the engineering building. So we do have the weather data, and then we're trying to predict what the weather will be next day or next week. And for example, if there's going to be a cloud cover, then we can imagine that the solar energy or the solar power will be less than during the sunny day. And so using the data on the temperature and cloud cover and even different variables such as humidity or wind speed, we are able to predict what the demand for the solar energy will be for the next day or week ahead. So we can plan and, for example, redistribute those energy sources in between like different energy avenues. For example, hydropower or cooling or solar energy or even like nuclear reserves. So just being like able to figure out where this energy demand will be and what kind of sources we can tap into, we can then optimize and find the energy alternatives in terms of like the cheapest cost. And also another area in terms of smart cities is to look at different traffic patterns on highways or intersections of roads. And then, for example, if we know that there's going to be a demand or like huge traffic on Saturday, we can then plan or devise an app that would redirect drivers into like another route to get to their goal. So just looking at the traffic patterns and trying to optimize what the like, not the fastest or not the most direct, but the fastest in the long run, because it helps you avoid traffic jams and it turns out to be the safest route for everyone. So that's kind of area I'm just working on, well, starting to work on. So this is right where I am right now. So again, I would like to say sincere thanks for everyone here and as well as on AAUW committee that were looking through the proposals and just giving me their vote of confidence and support in my project and in my own like graduate admissions plan and the choice for the graduate school. So again, thank you very much, and you made a difference in terms of when I started my graduate degree.
Dili Rohel, and she's only been here for 1 year. She was here, this is her second year. She's in a master's program. She's in the International Fellowship. She's a recipient from the Philippines who's studying at the Monterrey Institute of International Studies, specializing in international policy and development and actually specializing in monitoring, evaluation, and design. She is the third daughter of a family of 3 children, and they all seem to be pretty talented as well. And I'm very impressed with her English skills. And with no further ado, I'd like to introduce her.
I'm pretty excited to be here, and now I'm a bit nervous after speaking after such an eloquent speaker such as Adele. But yes, first of all, I would like to thank all of you, because I wouldn't be in the US today if it weren't for your support. But I'd get into a bit of storytelling down here. So I grew up in a family with high regard for education. I'm the youngest of 3 children and the clown of the family. I grew up in a university town called Los Baños, so in Spanish, the bathrooms. And I'm lucky I have parents and sisters who are very supportive of my professional and academic aspirations. And I remember one time my mom giving me a sermon for not wanting to join that international student exchange program to Japan in high school. And she was like, why would you pass up such an opportunity? I mean, every time you get an opportunity to widen your perspective and learn beyond conventional means, then you should take it. So when I was in college, in 2010, I went to the student exchange program in Canada. It was my first time traveling abroad, first time living away from my family for 4 months, the longest, and now is the longest. And it was great. The travel bug bit me. I fell in love with studying abroad, and I realized I enjoyed being around people from different countries and learning different cultures, which I wouldn't have learned if I stayed in the Philippines. And when I was in college, I told myself I would not want to go to graduate school. I'm done with studying. But look at me, 6 years after college graduation, I'm in my final year of graduate school, and this is also my second year under the AAUW fellowship. And yeah, but getting here wasn't easy. So this is a story that I knew I wanted to tell everyone from AAUW, just to show you how important this scholarship has been for me. I got accepted into the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, used to be Monterey Institute of International Studies. They changed their name last year. And I received a scholarship offer from the institute to cover half of my tuition. I was excited, but I knew it would be impossible for my family to cover the remaining tuition and the living expenses here in the US. So I had to defer my admission, hoping to find additional funding to support my education. And April 14, 2016, I received news that I was selected as an alternate for the AAUW International Fellowship. I remember forwarding that email to my mom and telling her, there's hope. A few weeks later, I received a request for confirmation of my attendance for the fall 2016 entry at the Middlebury Institute. And I had no choice but to tell them to close my file because there was no way I could find enough money to cover my expenses. I was frustrated, but at that time, I have learned that I have to accept that we cannot always have what we want. June 22, 2016, I received another email from AAUW, and this time, it was good news. I have been selected to become an AAUW International Fellow. I froze for a while, thinking to myself, this is it! I immediately emailed the institute to inform them about the good news, and they were happy to reopen my file. With only 2 months left to request for the documents that I needed for my visa sent from Monterey, California to my hometown in Los Baños, I was crossing my fingers that my visa would make it in time for my departure for the school year. And it did. I received my visa a couple of days before my flight to California. And I remember not believing that I was on a plane to California, and I just wanted to cry. I wasn't sure if it was because finally I'm going to California or I'm saying goodbye to my family, but I knew I wanted to cry. And finally I was in grad school, and that is all because of AAUW. When I read that I was encouraged to speak about what this fellowship means to me, I knew that I wanted to tell this story. Looking back on that roller coaster of emotions was a wonderful way of reminding me what it is that motivates me to keep me going in graduate school whenever I feel like giving up. It's the difficulty of getting here and the people that helped me get here. As a fellow and a graduate student at an international professional school, I had the opportunity to work on school projects with real clients, non-government organizations, to conduct field research in Nepal and to perform data analysis for an international research organization and practice Spanish in Colombia. And earlier this year, a team of students with 2 alumni as field coordinators went to Nepal to conduct a household survey on plastic waste disposal in Nepal. And that was quite an adventure. If you wanted to know more, you can come talk to me. And we visited rural villages in Midwestern Nepal and worked with interpreters. That was the first time. I'm a field researcher in the Philippines, but that was the first time that I've had the experience of working with interpreters and trying field research outside of my country. Over the summer, I went to Colombia as a visiting researcher for the International Center for Tropical Agriculture, where I worked with the impact assessment team in conducting data analysis, and I had the opportunity to learn a new data analysis software, which was pretty exciting and kind of nerdy, but exciting. It is from that I received the data that I'm using now for my independent study that I'm doing at the Middlebury Institute, where I'm currently working on Peruvian rice farmers' access to credit. So I'm looking at what influences their decision to apply for credit at the household level. So more of like demographics or poverty level, and not considering the requirements of credit providers. Strengthening my skills as a researcher and getting more practice in quantitative analysis are some of the most important learning opportunities I've had at MIS. Forgot to look at the camera. But those wouldn't be as meaningful had I not done it alongside supportive friends with whom I shared the struggles of grad school with. Tears of joy and hardship, stress eating, and panicking. If it weren't for AAUW, I wouldn't be studying in the US today. And so thank you for helping me get here. for helping women who are driven to learn and become leaders of social change achieve their dreams. I couldn't be prouder to be one of them. Thank you so much.
Peninsula chapter, and I'm very pleased to introduce Monica Yu, and she is from the Girl Scouts of Northern California, and this particular part of the Girl Scouts covers the area from Santa Clara to the Oregon border. They are based in Alameda County, and they received an action grant to expand an ongoing program that provides after-school activities for girls. And with no further ado, I introduce Monica Yu.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you to the AAUW for including me in this lovely event. Wow, it is certainly humbling to follow all of the young women who are fellowship recipients. Really, really impressive, and what great work the AAUW is doing to support all of them, as well as an organization like the Girl Scouts for a community service project. So I'm here representing Girl Scouts of Northern California. I'm actually here on behalf of my colleague, Whitney Evans Houston, who was the grant awardee. She's our director of community-based programs, and Whitney very much wishes that she could have been here in person, but she's on a very well-deserved vacation, so I'm here instead. It's really thanks to Whitney's tireless efforts and those of our program staff, our volunteers, our community partners and supporters, that more than 2,500 girls in Northern California get to experience Girl Scouts through special programs offered in under-resourced schools, low-income and migrant housing facilities, and juvenile justice sites. One of the most rewarding parts of being involved in Girl Scouts for me personally